That night, the city was fast asleep. The streetlights cast their pale glow against the thick curtains, making the apartment eerily quiet. I, Martha, 66 years old, woke up to a strange sound, water, clear and rhythmic. I looked at the clock, 3 in the morning. The sound continued, steady and unbroken, like someone taking a shower for far too long. At first, I thought I was imagining it. But as soon as my bare feet touched the cold wooden floor, the faint mist in the air made me shiver. The main bathroom was right next to my room. A dim white light seeped through the crack of the door, casting a faint line across the wall. I strolled toward it, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. The closer I got, the louder it became, the water hitting the tiles, booming in the stillness of the night. I pressed my ear against the door, a sharp breath, a muffled sob. I gently pushed the door open. It moved just enough for me to see 2 shadowy figures through the thick steam. I froze. My heart stopped. A chill ran down my spine. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally stepped back, my knees were trembling so hard I thought they'd give way. It took me a long moment before I could breathe again. Maybe I imagined it, I whispered to myself, but my instinct screamed otherwise. If you've ever heard a sound in the dead of night that made your heart tighten in fear, you'd understand me now. Subscribe to my channel and follow me to the end of a story that made a mother leave her son's home behind. I went back to bed, but sleep never came. That night, I knew something was wrong with this apartment. But before I tell you how it all began, you need to understand why I was so afraid. You need to know about my past, about a man, and about a promise I once swore to keep for the rest of my life. I was born in a small town where everyone knew each other's names, where winter laid a soft veil of frost over wooden fences, and roosters crowed from one house to the next. My youth was filled with chalk dust, the laughter of my students, and long walks home after class on roads carpeted with fallen maple leaves. Back then, I believed my life would flow as gently as the sound of the school bell at dusk. Then I met George. He worked at the local auto shop, strong, skilled, with eyes that seemed to say anything was possible. He told me, "You teach, I fix cars. Those 2 jobs keep life running smoothly." I believed him, and I married him. The first few years were truly happy. George bought me an old piano, saying he wanted to hear me play whenever he felt tired. But before long, he started drinking. Whenever work went wrong or friends made fun of him, he took it out on me, with harsh words at first. Then words turned into hands, into blows. I still remember that winter night vividly. Our 4-year-old son, Ethan, hiding behind the curtain while I lay on the floor, blood trickling from my lip, clutching a Bible with trembling hands. George shouted, threw a cup against the wall, and stormed out. The only sounds left were my child's sobs and the soft patter of rain on the roof. After every outburst, he'd apologize, bring flowers, promise to change. And I believed him, like so many women too gentle to give up hope. I told Ethan that his father was just a bit hot-tempered and made him kiss George goodnight. I thought if I were patient enough, love would save him. But love is no shield. It only keeps you standing still while you're being hurt. When the doctor told us George had terminal cancer, I didn't know whether to cry or to sigh in relief. I took care of him during those final months, not out of love, but out of duty. I thought that, at least, Ethan should see that his mother didn't abandon his father. The day George died, I sat by his hospital bed, holding his hand one last time. No tears, only the strange feeling that an old chain had finally broken. The sky that day was unnaturally clear, as if the whole town had been set free along with me. From that day on, I had only Ethan. Everything I did, every breath I took, was for him. I promised myself, my son will never grow up hearing angry voices. He'll be different from his father. He'll know love. I believed that, believed it as deeply as I believed in life itself. But faith, like water, will always slip through the cracks you never knew were there. After George passed away, only the two of us remained in that little house. At first, the evenings were eerily quiet. No more shouting, no more sounds of things breaking or doors slamming. I graded papers while Ethan sat at his desk doing homework, occasionally looking up to ask, "Mom, how do you spell this word?" Such a simple question, yet it always softened my heart. I worked tirelessly. During the day, I taught school. At night, I took on extra grading work. And on weekends, I tutored the children in town. All of it was for one purpose: to save enough for Ethan's education, so he wouldn't have to end up in a mechanic's shop like his father. Some nights, I was so exhausted that I fell asleep right at the table, pen still in hand. Ethan would quietly cover me with a blanket and whisper, "When I grow up, I'll buy you a big house, Mom." He was a bright, determined boy with a will stronger than most. He excelled academically, consistently ranking at the top of his class. Everyone in town knew Ethan, Martha's son, the bright and well-behaved child. Each award, each scholarship letter made my eyes well up with pride. I thought, George may be gone, but my blood lives on in him, and this time, that blood will be pure, kind. Ethan was accepted into a university in the city and later hired by a major company. I couldn't hide my pride whenever someone said, "That Ethan's really something," just like his mother, Mrs. Martha. Whenever he visited home, he wore a suit, spoke with confidence, and smiled radiantly. Beside him was Laura, a gentle, young woman, soft-spoken, with kind eyes and a voice like early autumn wind. Laura was a preschool teacher. From the first time we met, I liked her immediately. She was polite and attentive, constantly pouring me a cup of tea before we sat down. I remember when I saw them off after a visit, Laura held my hand and said, "I promise to take care of him the way you always have." Those words comforted me more than anything else could. A few years later, they got married. I stood watching my son slip the ring onto her finger, tears of happiness filling my eyes. I truly believed the painful days of the past were over. Ethan finally had the warm home I had always dreamed of. Then one day, while I was watering the tomato vines in the backyard, the phone rang. It was Ethan. "Mom, I want you to move in with us. I don't feel right leaving you alone all the time." I hesitated. I loved that house, the garden, the familiar neighbors. But then Laura took the phone, her voice sweet and gentle. "Mom, come live with us. I want our home to be a little livelier." I looked at the tomato plants, their fruit nearly ripe, and realized I had never really let anyone take care of me. I smiled and said yes. I didn't know then that this trip would lead me into a new nightmare, a place where I would have to face the very thing I feared most. The city where Ethan lived was nothing like the small town I came from. Towering buildings, streets packed with cars, and the blare of horns replaced the morning bird song. When Ethan's car stopped in front of the apartment complex, I gazed up at the 28-story building and felt a wave of dizziness. Their apartment was on the 20th floor, spacious, bright, and so modern that I was afraid to touch anything. Ethan was busy but thoughtful. He carried my luggage, showed me each room, and explained how to use the induction stove, washing machine, and air conditioner. "You need to check your blood pressure every morning, Mom. I bought a monitor. Remember to take your vitamins on time, and if you need anything, just ask Clara." He paused, glancing at Laura as if reminding her. Laura nodded and smiled. "Of course, I'll take good care of Mom." Her voice was soft, but there was a flicker of weariness in her eyes. I thought I was imagining it, so I simply smiled back. At first, everything seemed perfect. Breakfast was ready every morning. Laura poured me coffee, and Ethan praised her cooking. I felt warm inside, certain I had found a second home. But soon I began to sense something strange, something I couldn't quite name. Ethan spoke in a calm, steady tone, never raising his voice, yet every word seemed to fill the air with tension. Whenever he spoke, Laura answered immediately, never daring to look up. A single moment's hesitation, and his gaze alone could unsettle her. One evening, I offered to help wash the dishes. Laura shook her head quickly. "No, Mom, let me do it." Ethan added, "You should rest, Mom. You're not young anymore." I forced a laugh. "I'm still strong, you know." He smiled, but it was a cold smile, the kind people use when giving an order, not making a suggestion. The next day at dinner, it became even clearer. Laura sat across from me, holding the soup ladle with trembling hands. Ethan served me some fish, his tone gentle. "Eat more, Mom." But moments later, he turned to his wife, his voice still calm. "You haven't poured water for Mom yet?" The words were quiet, but they cut like a knife. Laura jumped up, flustered, and accidentally knocked over a glass. Water spilled across the table. Ethan smiled again, still smiling, but his eyes made my blood run cold. That night, I couldn't sleep. I told myself I was overreacting, that Ethan was simply under pressure from work, but when the clock struck 3, the sound of running water filled the apartment once more. It flowed steadily, endlessly, cold and sharp. I sat up, holding my breath, listening. Footsteps, the sound of a door closing. Steam slipped out from beneath the bathroom door, curling across the floor. That feeling, it was familiar. Too familiar. I had heard that sound before, in another house, belonging to another man. Part 5. From that night on, I began to measure time by the sound of running water. Every night at 3 a.m., the apartment echoed with that same sound, steady, unbroken, like a clock's tick striking directly against my heart. I lay still, afraid to move, feeling as though each drop was falling inside my chest. During the day, I pretended to forget. Laura and I went to the market, watered the balcony plants, and cooked for Ethan. Everything looked perfectly normal, almost too perfect. Laura still smiled, but it was the smile of someone who had learned to live with fear, faint, thin, never reaching her eyes. I noticed how she flinched at small noises, the clink of a spoon, the creak of a closing door. Sometimes she'd rub her wrist, where faint bruises still lingered beneath the skin. One morning, while we were having breakfast together, I asked gently, "Did anyone take a late shower last night? I heard water running. I thought someone couldn't sleep." Ethan didn't lift his eyes from the newspaper. His voice was calm, detached. "Me. Worked late, got overheated. Shower helps me sleep." A perfect excuse. But in that moment, I saw Laura freeze. Her hand stopped midair, her spoon nearly slipping from her grasp. Her eyes darted away, lips trembling slightly. I smiled, pretending everything was fine, but inside me, something began to stir, like calm water hiding a storm beneath the surface. I told myself, no, it can't be. My son would never. But logic couldn't silence the memories creeping back. The sound of water after every beating from George, the damp smell mixed with his heavy breathing, and that freezing dread sinking into my bones as I tried not to cry so my child wouldn't hear. The next night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the bed, watching. The clock, 2:45, 2:50. My fists clenched, sweat gathered on my palms despite the chill. When the minute hand touched 3, the water began again, as if testing me. I stepped into the hallway, stopping at the bathroom door. Steam drifted out from underneath, cold against my skin. I didn't dare open it. I knew that if I did, my world might collapse once more. I went back to bed, pulled the blanket over my head, hiding like a child from a nightmare. From that day on, I never slept well again. My eyes grew dark and heavy, my thoughts hazy. I started noticing every small detail, the red marks on Laura's neck, the way she spoke softly around her husband, and Ethan's gaze, calm, deep, and disturbingly similar to George's. One afternoon, I decided to ask Laura directly. I began carefully. "Sweetheart, you've looked so tired lately. Is something wrong?" She shook her head quickly, forcing a fragile smile. "No, Mom, I'm fine. I probably just haven't slept enough." That smile made my chest tighten. I realized then that silence can sometimes be louder than any cry for help. That night, I sat in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the city outside. And I knew, if I kept pretending not to see, whatever was lurking in this house wouldn't just destroy one woman. It would devour my soul, too. One morning, sunlight slanted softly through the window as Laura and I prepared breakfast. Ethan was still in his office, talking on the phone. His voice drifted through the door, low, steady, occasionally rising in irritation before falling silent again. I stood at the sink peeling an apple while Laura carried a plate of eggs. When she reached up to the top cabinet for the salt, her sleeve slipped down. A deep purple bruise spread across her wrist, uneven, the shape of 5 distinct fingers. I froze. The knife nearly slipped from my hand. "Laura," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What happened to your hand?" She stopped, turning toward me, eyes wide with alarm. In a flash, she pulled the sleeve back down and forced a smile. I bumped into the table, Mom. The corner's sharp, you know. My skin bruises easily." The words sent a chill through me. They were the exact same words I once told my neighbors decades ago when they noticed the marks on my face. The way Laura smiled, the way she rushed to hide her wrist. It was me, 30 years ago, all over again. My stomach twisted. I forced a smile. "You should be more careful, dear." She nodded, lowering her head to clear the table. Just then, I heard the office door open. Ethan walked out. The sunlight caught his face, deepening the darkness in his eyes. "Mom, why aren't you sitting down to eat?" he asked. His tone was calm, almost gentle, but something in it made the air heavy. I'm just peeling some apples for everyone," I stammered, my hands still shaking. "Let Laura handle it. You should rest." Then he turned to his wife. "She's tired. Don't let her do any kitchen work from now on." Laura bowed her head. "Yes." The rest of breakfast passed in silence. The clatter of utensils against plates sounded sharp and hollow. I bit into the apple. Its sourness spread across my tongue. After the meal, Ethan left for work. Laura washed the dishes quietly. I watched her small figure move about the vast kitchen, my heart sinking like a stone. As she walked past me, a faint scent of perfume mixed with the unmistakable smell of ointment, the kind I used to rub on my own bruises long ago. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words died in my throat, because I knew, when a woman starts hiding her wounds, it means she's already terrified beyond measure. That night, the water started again. 3 a.m. I lay in the dark, eyes wide open. The image of Laura's bruised wrist replayed in my mind, blending with the sound of water hitting the tiles. I understood then what was happening in this house was no longer a feeling. It was real, raw, cruel. And no matter how many times I turned away, the truth stood there, waiting for me to face it. That night it rained. The wind scraped across the window pane with a whistling sound, as if someone were tapping a rhythm outside. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep, heavy with a vague foreboding. When the clock hit 3, I heard the water again, this time louder, more violent than any previous night. I jumped up. The room was plunged in darkness. Only the hallway light leaked through the door crack, a dull, weary yellow. I threw on a sweater and went out. The wooden floor felt icy underfoot. The sound of water grew clearer, rushing, pounding against the tiles like the rain on the old tin roof years ago. I moved toward the bathroom. Steam spilled from under the door, thick with the smell of damp and soap. Beneath the rush of water, I heard other noises, a sharp gasp, then a strangled sob held back. I stood at the door, my hand trembling on the knob. My heart pounded, my legs felt like lead. Part of me begged, "Don't open it, Martha, don't do it." But another part, stronger and colder, forced me to look. I eased the door open. It wasn't locked. It swung wide enough for the harsh white light to stab my eyes. Through the heavy steam, I saw Ethan. He still wore his pajamas, hair plastered wet to his head, eyes rimmed red. Below him was Laura, soaked through, kneeling on the floor, her head thrown back under the stream of water pouring down on her face. Ethan had a fistful of her hair. His other hand was slapping her repeatedly. The sound was sharp and dry, mixed with the rushing water. "You dare talk back to me again? How many times have I told you to shut your mouth?" he snapped. Laura made no cry, only choked moans, her throat raw. Water hit her skin and splashed like hail. Her hair was matted, her eyes were wide with despair. I stood there, frozen. The scene before me overlapped with an old memory. George, flushed with drink, grabbing my hair and dragging me into the yard, dunking my head in the rain barrel. The sounds of water, of breathing, of pleading layered over one another, and I, the woman from years ago, was reflected in my own son. I wanted to scream, to rush forward, but my body was petrified. A cold ran down my spine. Every instinct left me with one command: run. I backed away, then turned and fled. I didn't dare look back or breathe deeply. Back in the bedroom, I slammed the door, collapsed onto the bed, pulled the covers over my head like a child terrified of ghosts. But the water sound kept coming, beat after beat, as if to remind me that I had seen the truth. I bit my lip. The metallic tang of blood spread in my mouth. Tears would not come. I shook in waves. That night, the water kept flowing, like a funeral hymn for the mother-child bond that had died inside me. At dawn, I stood before the mirror, eyes swollen, skin as pale as paper. In that pallid light, I whispered, "I have to leave this place. Immediately." The next morning, sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, gentle and oddly cold. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching those beams crawl across the floor, feeling hollow. I hadn't slept a wink all night. Every sound in the apartment made me jump: the knife on the cutting board, footsteps, the water in the sink. They blended into an obsessive noise, as if last night had never ended. Ethan went to work as usual, shirt perfectly pressed, tie straight. There was no sign he had turned into a monster the night before. Only Laura, her face slightly puffy, gave a weak smile as she poured coffee for her husband. I sat at the table looking at her but unable to meet her eyes. I knew that if our gazes met, everything would collapse. I forced down slices of bread. My throat felt tight. When Ethan left the apartment, I looked at Laura. She avoided my eyes and said softly, "Mom, the weather's nice today. Why don't you go out on the balcony and get some fresh air?" Her voice was small and hoarse, as if she'd spent the night crying quietly. I went out to the balcony and watched the stream of cars below. The world kept moving. People still laughed and lived, while I felt like I stood on the margins of life. I wanted to go into the bathroom to ask her one question: "Why didn't you leave?" But I didn't dare. I feared hearing the answer I had told myself for many years, because I had nowhere else to go. That afternoon, I packed a few things. Just a few clothes, an old photo album, some books, and a few pictures with my students. I wrote Ethan a short note. "Thank you for letting me stay, but I'm used to quiet. I want to move to a nursing home on the outskirts where there are people my age. Don't worry about me." I folded it and left it on the table. Laura came out and froze when she saw me dragging my suitcase. "Mom, where are you going?" "To a more peaceful place, dear." "Is it because of me?" she asked, voice shaking. I shook my head and forced a smile. "No, because of me." That was the first lie I told since moving in, and the bitterest. That evening, Ethan came home and initially protested fiercely. "If you do this, people will say I'm unfilial. You'll stay here and I'll take care of you." But I remained calm. "I've decided, don't stop me." He looked at me, his eyes cold, and seeing I was unshakable, he fell silent. The next morning, a car took me to the nursing home in the suburbs. The road passed rows of leafless trees. As my son's apartment receded, I exhaled. For the first time in months, I felt I could breathe. but relief lasted only a moment. Then guilt crept in, thick as morning mist. I had left Laura behind, left a soul being tormented. I told myself I was too old, too weak to save anyone. But deep down I knew I had just repeated the one mistake I had come to hate most: silence. In the first days in the nursing home, I moved like a shadow. Everything here was so quiet you could hear the wind through the trees. Each morning I did light exercise with a few other residents, read the paper, and drank chamomile tea. Anyone looking would think I was enjoying a peaceful old age, but only I knew that every night, when I closed my eyes, the image of Laura under that cold stream returned, her eyes wide and helpless. I had escaped that apartment, but I couldn't escape myself. One afternoon, while I was reading in the garden, someone called softly behind me, "Martha, is that you?" I turned. A familiar face, older, but the eyes still bright. It was Helen, an old colleague who used to teach literature at the high school. She'd retired early and had lived in this home for over 2 years. We hugged, delighted and a little stunned, like two wayward souls reunited after a long time. Our conversation soon drifted back to old days: chalk dust, the school bell, mischievous students. But after a while, Helen inclined her head and, voice low, said, "You don't look well, Martha. Your eyes, they remind me of myself back then." I froze. "Back then?" She nodded, hands trembling. "My daughter Anna was abused by her husband. I knew, but I thought every marriage had fights. I told her to be patient, to endure for the children. Then one day she came to me with a bruise on her cheek. I saw it and still said, 'Don't make people talk. Keep your marriage behind closed doors.'" Helen stopped, tears falling silently. 3 months later, she was hospitalized after a severe beating. I stayed silent until I nearly lost her. I thought I was protecting the family, but I was killing her day by day. I had no words. Her story was a mirror held up to me. Helen took my hand and looked deep into my eyes. "You've lived through that pain already. If you let someone else suffer now, you'll never be at peace. Your son, blood ties aside, is a man committing harm. That woman, you know she can't save herself. If you don't help, who will?" Each of her words felt like a dagger to the chest. I trembled, with fear and shame. Helen squeezed my hand harder. "You don't have to fight the devil, Martha. You only need to open the door to let the light in. You can be the one to bring her out of the dark." That afternoon, I walked through the quiet garden as yellow leaves fell around my feet. I looked up at the clear blue sky, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't look away. I asked myself, did I still have the strength? The answer came clearly from the deepest part of my heart. I cannot remain silent anymore. I returned to my room, opened the drawer, and took out the phone. Laura's number was still stored on the screen. I looked at it for a long time, then pressed the call button. 2 months after that rainy night, the court held the first hearing. The whole room was silent except for the sound of the officer's shoes on the stone floor. Ethan sat in the defendant's seat, his hair cropped short, his face gaunt, but his eyes still cold, as if he didn't understand what he had done wrong. I sat in the back row beside Attorney Daniel and Laura. She wore a white blouse. A faint scar still marked her neck, but her gaze was bright and determined. I held her hand tightly. She gave a slight nod as if to say, "I am no longer afraid." The trial began. Ethan's lawyer opened in an even tone. "Your Honor, my client is a successful man who bears heavy work pressures. Marital conflicts are normal. There is no clear evidence of abuse." The room murmured. I felt nauseous. They called it conflict, but none of them had ever seen a woman forced under cold water until she turned blue. Then it was Daniel's turn. He was calm, opened his laptop, and presented the evidence we had collected. Medical records documenting the injuries, Laura's daily journal entries, audio recordings of Ethan's verbal abuse, and finally, the video from the neighboring building's security camera. When the footage played on the screen, the room fell silent. In the video, Ethan drags Laura into the hallway, grabs her hair, shouts, and then strikes her repeatedly. Everything was clear, stark, and undeniable. The defense lawyer was left speechless. Ethan looked around, his face ashen. He shouted, "No, she made it up. I was only disciplining my wife." The judge rapped the gavel, voice stern. "Discipline is not synonymous with violence, and violence, sir, is a crime." The gavel fell again, decisive like a judgment on the past. Ethan bowed his head, silent. For the first time, I saw something like fear or remorse in his eyes. But it was too late. The court sentenced Ethan to 3 years in prison for domestic violence and unlawful confinement. Laura was granted full custody of the child and awarded compensation. When we left the courthouse, Laura stood on the steps, the afternoon sun on her face. She sighed, then turned to me. "Finally, I am free." I smiled, tears streaming down. "No, my daughter, we are both free." In that moment, I understood that justice is more than a sentence. It is when a victim stands up and is no longer afraid of the dark. Before we left, I looked at Ethan one last time. He was being led to the car. Our eyes met. For a moment, I saw the boy he once had been, studying under a desk lamp, bright and innocent. I wanted to believe that somewhere inside him, a piece of that boy remained. Then the car door closed, and I knew that son had been gone for a long time. A year after the trial, spring returned to the city. The wind carried the scent of fresh grass and magnolia blossoms soft as forgiveness. Laura invited me to her new apartment, small, bright, and full of the warmth of life. When she opened the door, the smell of baking and gentle jazz flowed out. In the sunlit room, I saw little Lily, about 7 months old, lying in her cradle, waving her arms and laughing. Seeing me, Laura picked her up, her face radiant. "Mom, meet your granddaughter," I choked up. That child was a miracle, born from a place once full of tears, now a symbol of hope. I held Lily in my arms. The baby looked up at me with dark, clear eyes like dewdrops. I realized life finds a way to sprout again, even on ground that has been trampled. Laura poured tea and sat across from me. She was different, sitting straight, eyes confident, voice soft but steady. "You know," she said quietly, "at first I thought I had only escaped one man, but I actually escaped the darkness inside myself. I learned to love myself instead of waiting for someone else to allow it." I smiled and took her hand. "You did it, Laura. You not only saved yourself, you also saved me." I told her about Helen and the other women at the nursing home, each carrying a wound but astonishingly strong when heard. I said I wanted to start a book club for women who had been hurt, a place where they could share and reclaim their voices. Laura squeezed my hand, her eyes shining. "I'll help you." That afternoon, as the sun turned golden, we took Lily to the park. The sound of children laughing and leaves rustling warmed my heart. I watched Laura push the stroller, sunlight on her face, and suddenly understood. That was the image of hope I had feared lost. I looked up at the sky and whispered, "George, do you see? The cycle of violence ends here. From now on, there will only be love." In the evening, I returned to the nursing home, light as air. I sat by the window and wrote the final lines in my old journal. I used to fear the sound of water at 3 a.m. Now I hear the rain and feel peace, because I know I chose rightly. I lost a son, but I regained my dignity, my courage, and a new family. Outside, a soft rain began. The drops on the window felt like a quiet reminder. Darkness was absolute, but light always returns if we dare to open our eyes to it. I am now 70. My hair is nearly white. My hand trembles when I write, but my heart is more peaceful than ever. Every morning I sit in the small garden at the nursing home, brew a cup of jasmine tea, and open the book I'm reading. The wind brings the scent of wet leaves and morning bird song into the room, gentle as the breath of a new life. Every weekend, Laura brings Lily to visit. The child grows quickly, rosy cheeks, bright eyes, always laughing when she sees me. She calls me Grandma, two simple words that make my chest tighten. Each time I look at her, I see Laura, myself, and all the women who once stood in the dark. Now their light reflects in a child's eyes. Sometimes people ask me, "Do you ever regret reporting your own son?" I pause, then answer, "I have regrets, but not because I did something wrong. I regret staying silent for so long." A mother's love does not die. It is hurt. But true love is not the same as tolerating evil. A mother can forgive, but she cannot shield herself from violence. If we fail to protect those who are wronged, we only help the pain continue for another generation. I realize that family is not only blood, it is where respect and kindness live. Without those two things, even people sharing a roof remain strangers to each other. Helen still visits. Our book club now has nearly 20 women, those who once suffered but now dare to tell their stories. We read, write, share, and most importantly, we listen. No one fears the sound of water at night anymore because everyone has learned to raise their voice against it. Once a young woman in the group asked me, "Mrs. Martha, if you could go back, what would you do differently?" I smiled and looked out at the falling rain. I would teach my son that real strength is not in the hand, but in the restraint of it. I would teach my daughters and all women that they were not born to endure, but to be loved and respected. I write these lines as a message to anyone still silently suffering in the dark. You are not alone. Silence never saves anyone. Step out, speak up. Only when the light is let in does the darkness fade. If you are listening to this story, please don't leave before you hit subscribe and share it. Not for numbers or fame, but because every view, every share, could be the hand that saves someone trapped in the night. Sometimes we are not just hearing a story, we are helping to rewrite someone's ending.